Thanks very much. Is this on? Can't tell. Okay. Thanks very much. And welcome to the first panel for this afternoon. And I'm delighted to be here and delighted to see everybody here. I understand this session, the theme for this session is dialectics. And we have two papers. The first is by David McNally, and I'm going to introduce him first. He teaches political science at York University, as many of you know. He also actively supports numerous social justice movements in Toronto. As a high school student, David joined the movement against the Vietnam War. On entering university, he organized a campus chapter of the Committee to Free Angela Davis. Early steps in a lifetime of activism in global justice, anti-racist and socialist movements. Along the way, he earned a PhD in social and political thought in 1983 and was hired as Professor of Political Science at York University, where he continues to teach. David is the author of 6 books: Political Economy and the Rise of Capitalism, Against the Market, Political Economy, Market Socialism and the Marxist Critique, Bodies of Meaning, Studies on Language, Labor and Liberation, Another World is Possible, Globalization and Anti-Capitalism, Global Slump, The Economics and Politics of Crisis and Resistance, and most recently, Monsters of the Market, Zombies, Vampires, and Global Capitalism. His articles have appeared in many journals, including Historical Materialism, Capital and Class, History of Political Thought, New Politics, Studies in Political Economy, and Review of Radical Political Economics. His research interests include the theory and practice of democracy, Marxism and anti-racism, socialist feminism, classical and Marxian political economy, Hegel and dialectical social theory, and the history of anti-capitalist movements. He actively supports a number of organizations, including the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, No One is Illegal Toronto, Faculty for Palestine, Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, the New Socialist Group, and the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. He's also on the advisory editorial board for Historical Materialism, and is a member of the Toronto Historical Materialism Group, which organizes a biennial conference at York. David lives in Toronto with his partner, Sue Ferguson, and their children, Adam, Sam, and Liam, all of whom indulge and often share in his love of jazz, baseball, and surrealism. And the paper he's going to give today is entitled The Flesh Made Word, on O'Neill's Orphic Marxism.
Well, thank you, Philip, for that lengthy introduction. I guarantee you I did not submit that. I'm amazed that you can... Marco, okay. I have you to blame for revealing all kinds of trade secrets, such as my love of jazz and so on. Let me first offer a few thanks, to begin with, of course, to Mauro Bucari, the Master of Founders College, who really initiated the idea for this workshop, and then, of course, to his amazing staff who have labored for months to put this event together. It's, I think, really timely, important, and appropriate that at York we take time to refer to one of the idioms of the last discussion, to slow down, to reflect on some of the intellectual practices that have over the years defined some of the spaces in this university as unique in generating critical social theory and critical theory more generally. And so I think it's, as I say, highly appropriate that John O'Neill and his work be honored and recognized in this way. I first encountered John's work as an undergraduate when I read Sociology as a Skin Trade in the 1970s. I never studied with John and came to know him best during my tenure as director of the graduate program in social and political thought in the early 1990s, when I also got to know people like Tom, who presented, that is Tom Kemple, as well as Tom Wilson, who's sitting behind him. And I also discovered in John some of our tribal heritage. telling him at one point about 9 or 10 years ago that I would have to get back to him about an issue he'd called me about concerning one of the doctoral programs here at York. I said to him, well, John, I'm going to have to get back to you because I'm heading off tomorrow for Ireland. At which point he said to me, David, we should demand reparations. And that was just the most fitting line as we were heading off, because, of course, there is a certain sense in which there are Irish idioms and traditions, not the least of which is Joyce, that run in and throughout John's work. I want to speak to some of the themes that orbit around the somewhat amorphous concept of Orphic Marxism that John develops in one of his texts, but in fact I want to suggest can be read through the prism of a number of his works. And I do so coming to this conversation as the first political scientist, whatever that means, who is speaking at this event. And yet it seems to me that one obvious entry point into John O'Neill's work involves reading him as a political theorist. His texts, after all, are replete with classical concerns for justice, freedom, and the well-being of the civic community. Engagements with political theorists from Plato, Aristotle, and Machiavelli to Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Marx frame these interventions. Yet, just when it seems that we can treat John as a recognizably political theorist, we become disoriented. Suddenly we find the discussion punctuated by Descartes, Montaigne, Hegel, Husserl, then radically reframed by Merleau-Ponty. We no longer, that is to say, those in my department, recognize the familiar markers of political science. Yet it is not that fundamentally political concerns have vanished. Rather, they have shifted into a sort of hyper-complex theoretical space. By way of a dialectical reversal, the story of the body politic has morphed into the politics of the body. Established narratives of social institutions are now being conducted in the idioms of biopower. Rather than having left Plato's cave, we are dwelling there, digging there, seeing it with new eyes, experiencing it with all our humanized senses. We are in the midst of a dizzying phenomenological reduction. In order to see the world and grasp it as paradoxical, wrote Merleau-Ponty, we must break with our familiar acceptance of it. And the same is true, I think, in O'Neill's hands for politics as well as for its emancipatory criticism, Marxism. In revisiting the adventures of the dialectic, Merleau-Ponty's momentous move was to force historical materialism to obey its own protocols and acknowledge its own history and historicity. And it seems to me that O'Neill travels this route, extends it, endeavoring thereby to return Marxism to its founder's insistence on corporeality and embodiment. And in the longer version of this paper, that's a claim that Marxist materialism doesn't begin from some abstract notion of matter, some metaphysical construct called matter, but instead from human embodiment and corporeality is something that I will try to flesh out in greater detail. Such a return to the body, or better, to the multiple forms of embodiment that comprise our being, inscribe O'Neill's humanist Marxism. Equally decisive, it provides him a route to a view of language and culture that resists logocentrism, to use a perhaps abused term now, while also overcoming emaciated theories of discourse and textuality that impoverish our sense of both the body politic and the politics of the body. Hegel, who recurs across John's texts, remarks in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit that thought must tarry with the negative. John O'Neill subscribes, I think, to this Hegelian dictum, but with the proviso that this means also tarrying with the body, itself the negative of capital and of idealism. As Adorno reminds us, the imperial ambition of the concept, which reaches an extraordinary height in Hegel, is to absorb the object, nature, and bodies into its self-movement. By tethering thought to the body, by insisting that we are thinking bodies, to use his term, O'Neill seeks to avoid the idealist move that sidelines the body, its labors, its suffering, its pleasures, its creations, its mortality, and in so doing deracinates the politics of the body that are essential to any emancipatory theory and practice. The body expresses total existence, observes Merleau-Ponty, an insight that frames John's meditations on the communicative body. It is here that we can see what a long way he is from a naive naturalism. To be a communicative body is to be simultaneously social and significative. A communicative body is dynamic, unfinished, historical, yet it remains irreducibly fleshy and material. Quote, "If they had no body, they would have no mind. It's all one," unquote, James Joyce remarked of the characters in his Ulysses. And O'Neill honors this Joycean injunction, "It's all one," across his reflections on language, theory, and culture. This, I would also insist, partly referencing an earlier discussion this morning, is not a call for a politics of the body in opposition to a politics of reason. And here, and this was an issue that Ted Winslow raised in Molly Mann's paper this morning, particularly in the essay that one finds in Sociology as a Skin Trade called Authority and Knowledge. It seems to me that John tries to sketch out precisely what he describes as the three levels of the body politic that are first captured in a particular kind of reading of Plato's Republic, but in which the organic body is taken up and mediated in and through language, history, culture, praxis, and so on, reconstructed in the idioms of knowledge and reason. And to quote one sentence there, John concludes from a brief discussion of Plato and Aristotle, "The transition to the polis is a transition in the order of art or moral knowledge." And it seems to me that this politics of the body is always in the way in which John is casting it in his work, centrally involving the order of art or moral knowledge, as he puts it there. In a Hegelian idiom, one would recast it in terms of ethical life and reason. Not surprisingly, John is especially fond of Vico's dictum that words are carried over from bodies. Again, defying the idealist injunction that the word is made flesh, O'Neill shows us the flesh giving birth to the word, even while recognizing that the word in turn becomes flesh, mediating, socializing, and historicizing it. Yet the bodies from which words are carried over do not disappear in the self-movement of textualization. They stubbornly live on in the very stuff of language himself. And in the text that Tom Kempel discussed this morning, Five Bodies, John has this wonderful and lengthy passage from Vico that I won't quote at the length that he does, but just to give you a sense of it. He quotes Vico, "It is noteworthy that in all languages, the greater part of the expressions relating to inanimate things are formed by metaphor from the human body and its parts, and from the human senses and passions. Thus, head for top or beginning, the brow and shoulders of a hill, the eyes of needles and of potatoes, mouth for any opening, the lip of a cup or pitcher, the teeth of a rake, a saw, a comb, the beard of wheat, the tongue of a shoe, the gorge of a river, a neck of land, an arm of the sea, the hands of a clock," and so on. And this notion of that John takes from Vico, of words being carried over from bodies, seems to me to centrally inform all of his phenomenological meditations on language and culture. Now, as I have intimated, in approaching language through the body, O'Neill resists the abstract linguistification of existence that animates so much post-theory. To be sure, he shares deconstructive criticisms of logocentrism, but rather than respond to the latter by upholding textuality against orality, O'Neill traces both back to the body as the site not merely of communicative action, separated from other forms of embodied activity, a la Habermas, but indeed of communicative being in all its robust and manifold expressiveness. In this spirit, he seeks to bring together Marx and Vico, each of whom he identifies as a theorist of the body as the site of the civilizing and humanizing figure of work, in order to construct an Orphic Marxism, about which I shall shortly have more to say. But before broaching that, a few words might be in order concerning O'Neill as a critic of capitalism. And I want to emphasize my reading of John's work, particularly in this vein, because I think that it can be recast in a more Habermasian and, dare I say, social liberal way that his critique of capitalism resists. And so I want to spend a moment on this. And here I will refer to something of John's own intellectual formation, which I've never discussed with him. I've simply gleaned from reading his texts. And that's the significance of his own mentoring by Paul Buran, his doctoral supervisor at Stanford in the late 1950s. Now, Buran is best known for his books in political economy, particularly The Political Economy of Growth from 1957 and Monopoly Capital from 1964, co-written with Paul Sweezy. Yet Buran's Marxism was of a much wider and more heterodox character, embracing psychoanalytic theory and cultural criticism. Especially important for John, I suspect, was his mentor's emphasis on the alienation and anomie characteristic of late capitalism. In one compelling passage, and this is in a book that John edited, The Longer View, a set of essays by Buran, Buran wrote that, quote, "The societies of the advanced capitalist societies are ill, being characterized by economic stagnation, cultural decay, and a widespread sense of despondency," unquote. Consistent with this, O'Neill picked up the themes of alienation and estrangement in Marx's critique of capitalism and made them central parts of his own critical enterprise. Yet John gives these themes a phenomenological twist, emphasizing the broken and distorted forms of communication characteristic of such a society and the psychic and spiritual suffering this entails. O'Neill's humanist Marxism draws centrally on the Hegelian dialectic of recognition in this regard. The Hegelian Marxist theory of freedom pivots on notions of mutuality, reciprocity, and intersubjectivity. Yet these can only be accomplished via estrangement and its overcoming. In this sense, it seems to me, another Joycean theme is present across John's work, which is the famous line from Ulysses, "History hurts." In many respects, it is the wounds of history that frame so many of John's meditations, I think, not just on this Hegelian Marxist tradition, but indeed on Freud as well. The humanization of social life crucially revolves in this tradition around the constitution of a civic community in which human agents recognize and actualize themselves in the very institutional forms in which they embed their social relations. No surprise, then, that Hegel's dialectic of recognition occupies a privileged position in O'Neill's oeuvre, and unfortunately we don't have the book that John edited, into which he wrote an introductory essay on the dialectic of desire and recognition in Hegel on display here. But it seems to me, as I say, that this is a key Hegelian theme that animates so much of John's Marxist humanism or Hegelian Marxism. And he draws our attention to precisely those compelling passages in which Marx foregrounds mutual recognition as the index of a non-alienated society. In so doing, he makes the accomplishment of non-distorted communication the infrastructure of his humanist socialism. Discussing Marx and Freud in this regard, he writes that they sought, quote, "to deliver the human body from the pain of labor, unquote, and from, quote, incommunicable pain, in order that we, quote, might all express ourselves in the risen body of the communicative body. And here, by the way, I think this is so multi-layered. And I can read a passage like this through Freud, through Marx, through Hegel, through Joyce, and in fact, I think that John, as I suggested, is working in all those idioms. O'Neill thus situates Marx's account of capitalism as more than a systemic structure of exploitation. He grasps it as equally a critique of the degradation of the experiential web of life in a society in which need, sense experience, language, and culture are all colonized by the abstracting circuits of capital. In this register, he cites Alfonso Lingas's claim that in capitalist society, quote, all the pleasures and pains produced on the surface of life are inscribed, recorded, fixed, coded in the transcendent body of capital. The project of socialist humanism is therefore meant to recuperate the communicative body from the abstracting body of capital's endless and empty self-expansion. Given more time, I would even suggest that that frames some of the discussion we had earlier around Plato's cave and so on, but I'll have to leave that for another time. And it is here that we can find O'Neill gesturing to the communicative body that runs as a utopian promise through our hands and our history. Talking of Montaigne, Descartes, and Merleau-Ponty, he writes, quote, the same shining world surrounds me as it did them once before, while the silence of my study murmurs with their voice in the turning pages of my reading, and their time runs into mine through this hand, writing. Here we have the communicative body as communal, historical body, constituted in intellectual traditions which are themselves embodied and passed on by mouths and by hands. And again, in the longer version that I'll prepare of this paper, I want to spend a little bit of time on John's references to hands and the way in which this fundamentally human organ, one intimately tied to labor and to language, figures as almost a countertrope to the capitalist separation of the hand from mind and body, in the classic reduction of workers to hands, farm hands, dock hands, hired hands, and so on. John is actually stitching hands back together in the practice of writing into their full humanity and communicative dimensionality. Indeed, in a quite poignant passage, which he calls the introduction to sociology as a skin trade, he writes about his own parents' hands. To quote John again, I am a sociologist, God help me. Better say I am one of the people, born without difference, dying now of rage, of beauty, of love, of pain, but for work and its hopes and passions that tie me to my fellow men. What is the word that will touch them? Too many words, certainly, or the wrong words, will only separate me from them. I am a Marxist without a revolution, though my mother and my father still work. My mother's hands, my father's hands. How shall I separate what is cruel from what is beautiful in the story of their lives? And it seems to me that in that incredibly poignant, moving passage, when I read this as an undergraduate, for me, this embodied in the text the very Marxist humanism that I was finding animating this work by John. To declare one's solidarity with Marx in this way entails, of course, an ethical responsibility to take up the weight of a history of violence and failure while not relinquishing the cause of universal emancipation. This means to dwell self-consciously in the realm of ambiguity without abdicating praxis. Marxist politics, wrote Merleau-Ponty, is, just like all the others, undemonstrable. The difference is that Marxist politics understands this and that it has, more than any other politics, explored the labyrinth. Now, I must say, I take this statement to be more programmatic in character than in a summary of actual behavior. In other words, I wish it were more true of the Marxist tradition of politics. But nevertheless, I situate John here as one whose Marxism indeed does explore the labyrinth, stays within the cave, turning the protocols of historical materialism back upon itself, as I have suggested above. Humanist Marxism, quote, humanist Marxism must keep itself in question, unquote, he has urged, implicitly posing the question, can Marxism be critical, that he had earlier put to phenomenology. But the cause of a self-reflexive Marxism is incomplete without its rerouting through the dimensions of embodiment and the communicative body. Running across his vision of a better society is the notion of the liberation of the human sensorium, of the transcendence of abstract labor, of the overcoming of the division between mental and manual labor, and the eroticization of everyday life. Indeed, of what Walter Benjamin calls the emancipation of the flesh in his effort to ground Marxism in an anthropological materialism. In this regard, I think O'Neill wants to recast Marxism too as a skin trade, and to, quote, restore its symbiotic connections with the body politic, and to situate it in relation to the exchange of organic needs and the utopian celebration of libidinal community which surpasses all understanding, unquote. In this idiom, he joins hands with the utopian heretics of the Marxian tradition, Benjamin, Marcuse, and Bloch among them. And here we encounter O'Neill's Orphic Marxism, itself a gesture to Marcuse's discussion of Orpheus and Narcissus in Eros and Civilization. Here he indicates a Marxism which sees that, quote, the human world is at every level of sensation, perception, thought, and action, a social praxis in which our inner and outer worlds are mutually articulated. And as you'll see, I'm trying to essentially read what is a very quick gesture to an Orphic Marxism through particularly some key texts in both sociology as a skin trade and as well the communicative body. It remains an under-theorized opening, I think, but one which invites the development of what I've elsewhere called the concept of corporeal reason. But I think something else is lurking here, something that gestures back to the dialectic of freedom, embodiment, and recognition. I speak here of the libidinal body politic, the expressive, pulsating, rebelling, celebrating body of the people in the course of making freedom. This, too, I think, is an integral dimension of O'Neill's Orphic Marxism. I want to suggest that there is here very much at work a notion of reason, but as I suggested, a kind of corporeal reason, an immanent rationality that at moments of mass social protest and insurgency creates the immanence of an alternative rationality to that of capital. The libidinal body politic, John writes, is a work of art. It presupposes the constructs of the organic and sensible body politic, but aims at a mere distinctly human form of political life. The imagery of the libidinal body politic is above all the vehicle of radical politics. It promotes autonomy and creativity rather than subordination and specialization. It identifies freedom with creativity and regards these as the criteria of the health and the sanity of the body politic. Finally, discussing all of this is an essay that John published in 1970, The Authority and Knowledge, one which reappears in sociology as a skin trade. He turns to some of the freedom movements of his era. And he writes, today we observe an articulation of the body politic in the simple and common sense demands of people everywhere for self-respect, for freedom of speech and movement, and for hope which makes for dreams and laughter. Mrs. Rosa Parks could have walked to almost any place in the small town of Montgomery. But on Thursday afternoon, December 1st, 1955, she took a freedom ride. And soon people were on the march. In 1960, 4 college freshmen sat down at the lunch counter at Woolworth's in Greensboro, North Carolina. These actions typify the nonverbal rhetoric of the body politic, which revitalizes the esprit de corps of oppressed peoples. John then turns to a discussion of Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice and Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and he concludes this essay with what I think is in many respects a signature statement of what I'm calling the possibilities of Orphic Marxism. The pulse of sensuous being and the authority of sweet reasonableness, whose voice is justice and whose medium has always been the people. And that, it seems to me, is ultimately what we ought to be trying to preserve, recuperate, extend, and develop in John's reflections on Hegel, Marx, Freud, and the idea of a critical theory in practice which does not relinquish the goal of human freedom and emancipation. Thank you.
And my question has to do with something I've mentioned to you before, which is Marx in the economic and philosophic manuscripts indicates quite explicitly what his relation to the phenomenology is. And he says the outstanding achievement of the phenomenology and of its final outcome, he describes this as its final outcome, which is the dialectic of negativity, and then he elaborates the dialectic of negativity, which he says he's also taken, sublated from the phenomenology, is estrangement within the labor process. But that makes estrangement within the examination of estrangement within the labor process a science. In Hegel's sense, when he elaborates the dialectics of negativity, which is it's the bringing of the work of reason, specific work of reason, which is in the thing, to consciousness. Mm-hmm. So, and that's his idea of scientific socialism. So I don't know if that's present. I don't see that present in that aspect of Marx's own understanding of his relation to the phenomenology as present in John's interpretation of it.
Shall I take a few questions? Or?
We can start with that one and then we'll... Yes. Sure.
Yeah, well, and listen, like previous presenters and commentators, I'm not taking it as my job to speak for John, okay? The way I read his discussion of the phenomenology, both there's a couple of essays on Hegel and Marx in Sociology as a Skin Trade. There's also the opening essay in the volume Hegel's Dialectic of Desire and Recognition. And I see the dialectic of negativity as present in that reading. It is probably true that John emphasizes less in that reading the moment of reflection upon estrangement that you're talking about Marx picking up on. Although I think in his commentary on, for example, Kojève, there, you can see that he's tracking that process. But what I'm trying to suggest with the idea of Orphic Marxism is not that John gave a final formulated package we just all inherit, so much as it seems to me that there are certain kinds of pathways that he's walking here that ought to be developed, extended, other byways off of them developed, and so on. But it seems to me that in terms of the problem of science, there's no question that John's Marxism is also, I didn't even speak to this, a very powerful reaction against Althuserian scientism. And I didn't even talk about the For Marx Against Althusser volume. And so, yeah, I think it may, Ted, you may be right that it invites us to return to the question of science and reason in the Hegelian Marxist tradition as an extension and development. Yeah.
I have a question. Well, it's really a point of information or clarification. I'm interested in Paul Baran. I don't know much about him, and I know you mentioned there was a partnership with Paul Sweezy, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sweezy is sort of renowned as a sort of forerunner of world systems theory. He was sort of reacting to kind of nationalist Marxist theory. I guess that's my understanding. I just wonder if you could say a bit more about that and maybe how that's influenced John's work or John's perspective.
Again, I hesitate. Yeah, I hesitate to speak for John too much here, but I think it's really, it's really important when we do the intellectual history of this era to recognize how unique and powerful both Sweezy and Baran were. I mean, you're talking about Cold War America, where you have in Paul Sweezy a pioneering Marxian political economist who gets driven out of Harvard, and in Paul Baran, the only tenured Marxian political economist in the United States in that period of time. No, but Anderson comes much, much later. And Anderson, is in Britain, and he only much later comes to UCLA. But in the United States, both Sweezy and Baran represented a kind of an intellectual tradition of an independent socialism, as they called it, an independent Marxism. They weren't party allied, but they were trying to keep alive some kind of critical Marxism that was engaging with some of the key problems of American society. Baran, however, his work moved into a variety of areas that Sweezy's did not. And I mentioned in particular psychoanalytic theory. And I think you can see in his work a whole number of affinities and why Baran and Marcuse would have had such an interesting set of exchanges, because they're coming out of a very similar historical moment, but Baran more steeped in the traditions of radical and heterodox political economy. And I think it's fascinating to see some of John's early work when he is, for example, writing his introduction to The Longer View, this set of essays by Baran. And I think, as I was trying to suggest, that John is an inheritor of a certain kind of critical Marxism, of which Baran was one of the very, very few practitioners in the United States at the time. He then picks up on some of the themes in Baran and runs them through other traditions, particularly phenomenology. But I think it's very important when we're thinking about the communities of the left and the intellectual traditions of the left to sort of recognize the ways in which these histories weave together, and that someone like Baran, who seems to be so much outside of this kind of discussion today, actually played a role in shaping someone like John, in helping to form someone like John's appropriation of a kind of critical Marxism, which he then did new things of his own.
I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about your own work and how it might be rooted in this rereading, this inaugural rereading of that O'Neill does of the economic philosophical manuscripts of the difference between estrangement and expression, and Tuiseronken and Fremdung, which is there in the center of that Orphic Marxism essay. So it's kind of like that's where I see the phenomenology is the difference between the externalizing and objectifying the world and making it, and also reappropriating it, and then the difference between that and when it's taken from you, the object, the project, the product, the process, our whole species being is taken from us. And in some ways I'm exasperated by contemporary, not your work, but others of contemporary Marxist political economy, which is great, but for sort of missing and losing that lesson. I'm wondering if you could just speak about that and how that might inform your own work.
Yeah, and it'll allow me to maybe do a little bit more justice to Ted's question earlier as well. And I'll come at it from a different angle, Tom, than you posed it, but I hope it comes into it. I read Marx in Capital as, at one level or in one idiom, a kind of Brechtian avant les lettres. And by that what I mean is, I think Marx is engaged in a deliberate kind of alienation effect. He is saying to us that we move in this world of commodities and we think we know what they are. They're in fact incredibly mysterious. And we need to become estranged from the familiar, which is, to go back to my all too brief response to Ted, we need to become estranged from our estrangement. And this is a simultaneously theoretical and practical task. But of course, to become estranged from estrangement is to be able to name it as estrangement. Okay? That's crucial. Otherwise, it is the familiar, it's the normal, it's the naturalized, it's the everyday. And so I think, when Hegel begins his phenomenology by alienating us from sense certainty, okay, and telling us that this is crucial to the project of reason, I think that the Marxian meditation on estrangement is precisely about that, to estrange us from it so that there's the shock of recognition that Brecht argues epic theater is designed to accomplish, where we recognize the everyday as itself strange and estranging. And so, yes, I think that what's really interesting here is the ways in which these Hegelian Marxian themes can be worked together in a much richer way. And although I haven't even had the opportunity to go into the psychoanalytic dimension, which I think is equally interesting, particularly around Freud's concept of the fetish. But if I go there, we'll be at this a lot longer, so I won't.
Just one question. When you said this, oh, sorry.
You have to stand up.
I have to stand up. Okay, I'll repeat myself. Just one question. When you said the estrangement, we have to become estranged from estrangement, it struck me that's one interpretation of the epoché. And I'm wondering whether you want to comment on that, bring in the phenomenological.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right, and it's why I smuggled in that quick quote from Merleau-Ponty, because Merleau-Ponty is there trying to rehabilitate that Husserlian move. That's entirely how I read him. In other words, we must be able to take a step out of the natural attitude. To do that, to engage that phenomenological reduction, I think is precisely to estrange ourselves from our estrangement, that the natural attitude is itself estranged. And so, yes, I thank you for pushing me on that, Brian, because I think you're right.
Okay, thank you, Dave.
Thank you.